Like many others, I've succumbed to spending a lot of money on video games that I never end up playing. Over the years, my Steam library has ballooned in size to nearly 500 games, and I had yet to even play half of them. The thought of chipping away at the backlog, while appealing, is a daunting task. After seeing videos from Daryl Likes Games and Rasputin late last year, I decided that keeping a chart of every game I beat this year would be a good way to motivate myself to keep whittling my library down. I'll be going through all the games I beat for the first time this year in chronological order, sharing my thoughts on them, and determining if I enjoyed my time with them or not. To start things off, we'll begin with a game I started to grind at the tail end of 2022, Tetris Effect Connected. Out of every game on this list, I might have put the most hours into Tetris Effect Connected. I've always been a fan of Tetris, and I was fortunate enough to attend E3 in 2018 when Tetris Effect was originally unveiled. I tried to go hands-on with the game, but it was only available on PSVR demo stations, and we were informed that you had to have had a scheduled time in order to try out any demos. It wasn't until the game finally came to Steam, with the all-new Connected expansion in 2021, that I had the opportunity to play it, but I was hesitant to spend that much money on what was, at its core, a game I could play in my browser for free. Eventually I decided to bite the bullet during the winter sale in 2022, and I proceeded to spend the rest of the year grinding away at the game, experimenting with every mode, taking on cosmic horror, and as the year came to an end, I only had one goal in my eyes: 100% completion. As the name implies, I was starting to experience a Tetris effect myself, fantasizing about how many lines I'd have to conceivably clear in any given game in order to work my way towards leveling up to be a Grand Master and unlocking every achievement. Finally, after around 80 hours of playtime, I had reached my goal, and I stepped away from the Tetris Effect grind. But I did revisit the game throughout the year in quick bursts as a time sink, and it ended up being without a doubt one of my favorite games I played all year. The next game to check off my backlog was Death's Door. I didn't know what to expect going into this one, as all that I knew going into it was that the game was well received for its difficulty in world building. While I've seen the game described online as a Souls-like, I've never played a game of that genre before, so I treated Death's Door as if it was baby's first Souls-like game. The game did so many small things well, from the art to the combat, and it was a game that I thoroughly enjoyed playing this year. I grew up watching a lot of machinima adjacent channels, and one of my favorite creators was Dexter Manning. For years he would post updates on a game he was working on called Flappatron. It's a visual novel / rhythm game hybrid, and the game had all of the signature dialogue and jokes I had come to expect from Dex over the years, but I will admit that some of the recurring gags did start to get old after a while. I'm looking at you, the Clinking Man. When it comes to visuals, Ori and the Will of the Wisps might have been the most beautiful game that I played this year. I'll be the first to admit that I don't have the best sense of direction when it comes to Metroidvanias, but Ori's interconnected world clicked with me in a way that I wasn't expecting. I found myself remembering exactly where past obstacles were and knowing how to get back there immediately when I unlocked the corresponding abilities. It had been years since I played the original Ori and the Blind Forest, so my memory of the story was a bit hazy, but when I saw Ku hatch out of the egg, it all started to come back to me, and it continued to build on the world that Moon Studios has crafted. For years, Hades had sat at the top of my Steam wishlist. I'm a big fan of roguelikes, but wasn't sure how I felt about playing one in early access, after I had burned out with Crypt of the Necrodancer before its official release. After a couple years of waiting, I decided it was time to finally get down to business, then promptly ignored the game in my library for a couple of months. After finally escaping the underworld and defeating the titular Hades on my 10th escape, I thought to myself that the game was fun, but I questioned if it had the replayability of The Binding of Isaac or Spelunky. And yet I found myself trying to escape over and over again, and next thing I knew, I had 100% of the game and spent most of February playing it. Hades deserved all the praise it has received over the years, and Dusa is the best girl. I first played Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance back in 2014, and I didn't get past the helicopter in the first mission. I don't recall why I stopped playing that early on, but we'll chalk that up to my computer at the time being severely underpowered and not designed for gaming. Personally though, I was not the biggest fan of Metal Gear Rising. I thought the combat was very repetitive, and the slicing parts in particular didn't click well with my smooth brain. Playing Oddworld Munch's Odyssey as a kid, I always liked to go to the extras menu and watch the story recaps and cutscenes of the original Abe's Odyssey. Around 20 years later, I finally decided it was time to play through the remake of Abe's original adventure. I must admit though, the gameplay did not seem to age very well. Clunky controls unfortunately made my experience with Oddworld new and tasty, something I'd rather not relive anytime soon. Darksiders Warmastered Edition was an enjoyable action-adventure game that reminded me somewhat of pre-Breath of the Wild Zelda games. Like most of THQ's mid-2000s catalog, I couldn't tell you exactly what was going on in the story, as it seemed to jump all over the place, but it was a solid game I'd recommend to someone looking to scratch that old 3D Zelda itch. Also, every time Abaddon came on screen, I was like the Wojak guy and thinking, that's the guy from Dota! The only things that I knew going into Outer Wilds is that you explore a solar system and that you're stuck in a time loop. As you set off on your journey as an astronaut, you uncover the mysteries of the universe and learn about the history of those that came before you. Reading comprehension is vital in order to solve Outer Wilds, and while I pride myself for reading at a high school level when I was 9 years old, the game did not click with me as much as I expected given the critical acclaim it had achieved. From a technological standpoint, Outer Wilds is mind-blowing with how it simulates the solar system in real time, yet the rest of the experience didn't meet my lofty expectations. Mirror's Edge feels straight out of 2008, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Parkour was all the rage, and you couldn't turn a corner without being blinded by bloom lighting. The gunplay was half-baked, but the chase sequences more than made up for it, because when you enter the flow state, the game was very satisfying to play. April Fool's Day brought us the Sonic the Hedgehog visual novel Murder Mystery that we've all been clamoring for since his Twitter account became self-aware. Taking place on a train reminded me of the XS Express from Chapter 6 of Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, which really lends itself well to a mystery setting. The minigame that you played while gathering evidence, while repetitive, was a fun little diversion that I looked forward to throughout this short but sweet Sonic experience. A friend gifted me a copy of Pyre not long after it was released, and it only took me 7 years to get around to playing it. Thanks, mate, by the way. I could write more, but I'll instead refer to the review said friend demanded that I write after delaying my playthrough all those years. Not a day goes by that I don't hear Moon's Hydrogen after I beat Hotline Miami. After playing Hades earlier in the year, it was time to double down on Greek mythology and play Apotheon, a 2D action game with an art style based on ancient Greek pottery. It's a short game, and while the gameplay and narrative are nothing to write home about, the visual design was enough to keep me invested to see how creatures from ancient Greece were going to be depicted. My Friend Pedro was a strange game. I couldn't tell you anything about what's going on in the game, other than that a sentient banana guides you as you shoot your way out of a facility. Pedro heavily encourages replayability due to its combo system and parkour mechanics. If I was interested in doing so, I could have found myself enjoying Pedro more, but I have a backlog to clear, and there wasn't in time to improve my scores. The LEGO Ninjago movie video game was a nice change of pace after the recent string of combo-based games. I haven't played a LEGO game since the original LEGO Star Wars trilogy, nor have I ever watched LEGO Ninjago, let alone the LEGO Ninjago movie. Suffice to say, after playing the game and watching Duckbricks' 10-hour deep dive of the LEGO Ninjago lore, I can safely say that I am on my way to my Spin Jitsu certification. I'm lumping Broforce and Expendabros together, since they were essentially the same game. These two didn't hit for me, though I did enjoy seeing all of the bros' names that they gave to the classic action heroes that make up the playable rosters. Did I really convince myself it was a good idea to play Duke Nukem Forever? Yes. Was it good? Not really. Did I enjoy my time with it? For the most part. I did spend longer than I'd like to admit drawing this cock and balls on the whiteboard at the beginning of the game, though. Proteus is nothing more than a walking simulator. This one left no impression on me whatsoever. Papo Yo was an unexpected gem that had been sitting in my library for years. The game deals with heavy themes such as domestic abuse and alcoholism through the use of allegories of how a child internalizes those issues. I particularly enjoyed the Brazilian architecture featured heavily throughout the world. While I personally am not affected by the themes presented, I've spent over a decade working with children who come from underprivileged backgrounds, including some who fall under the aforementioned categories. I've put a link in the description below to the organization's website if you are interested in learning more. Mobile games don't always translate well when they're ported to other devices. Case in point, Superbrothers Sword and Sworcery EP by Superbrothers and Capybara Games. The controls and pixel art were designed for iOS and Android devices, and that felt evident while playing on PC with a keyboard and mouse. The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom unequivocally was the game that both made me laud and question my own intelligence this year. Building off the foundation set by 2017's Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom took everything that I knew from the first game and stripped it away from me. Gone were the days of stasis launching and wind bombs, replaced by the ability to fuse weapons together and attach objects with a green goo.
What's this icky paint-like goo? It's moving!
I'd find myself in the tutorial shrine unable to figure out basic puzzles, only to later be building spring-propelled cars with ease. I wouldn't be shocked to see academic studies conducted by players who were introduced to physics engines by playing Tears of the Kingdom. The Sky Islands and the depths aren't nearly as fleshed out as Hyrule itself, but one of the best parts of Tears of the Kingdom was figuring out how I would get to that area off in the distance, rather than taking the nearest Skyview tower or chasm. Another thing I enjoyed was how Nintendo expanded upon the history of Hyrule with the introduction of the Zonai civilization and how the world as we knew it today came to be. The dungeons were also a big step up from Breath of the Wild. Divine Beasts and Blight Ganons are no more, replaced by actual temples reminiscent of the series past, while keeping them open in nature. Stormwind Arc was a particular favorite of mine. Boss fights were a massive improvement over the repetitiveness of the first game's roster. It all culminates in what may be the biggest showpiece fight in the franchise, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing when it dawned on me as to what was about to happen. If there's one game that defined 2023 for me, it is undoubtedly The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom. After Tears of the Kingdom ate up most of May, I took a step back from playing games during June. I was out of town for a week, and when I returned, whether it was seasonal depression or just a lack of interest, I didn't have any desire to play games. It was at this point that the idea of chewing through my backlog started to wear on me a bit. Was I really enjoying this experience, or was I only doing this because I told myself I would? A couple of weeks passed, and I picked up a game I abandoned after a short time long ago, The Swapper, a puzzle game about cloning yourself. The game is set on an isolated space station with little signs of life. Maybe it was just my mental state at the time, but the environments, which were impressively made by modeling clay, were lonely but strangely calming. Next up was Call of Juarez Gunslinger, a fast-paced and short-lived game set in the Wild West. The highlight for me was the unreliable narrator who was setting up different scenarios as to how Silas Greaves took down the most notorious outlaws in American history. June capped off with another puzzle game, this time being Edge. It's a short puzzle game where you roll a cube through the environment to get to the goal at the end. It was quick, simple, and had very nice music. We've reached the halfway point of the year, and outside of Hades and Tears of the Kingdom, I hadn't sunken my teeth into a large story game this year. Enter Final Fantasy VII. Never having played a game in the series, there was no other place to start than the most famous game in the franchise. A game as notorious as Final Fantasy VII is unavoidable, so I knew about the big moment. I'm not a big fan of RPGs, probably because I can't seem to comprehend anything more complex than Pokemon's type matchups. Eventually I found my rhythm with the battle system, until I came face to face with Carry Armor. I could not for the life of me manage to beat this guy, and I ended up resorting to a guide that recommended going out of my way to the Wutai region, fighting a Razorweed, and using the enemy skill materia to steal Magic Hammer from them. I didn't even have an enemy skill materia since I sold the one I obtained earlier in the game, so I had to look up where to get another one too. After doing so, and finally defeating Carry Armor, I continued on and eventually finished out the game after 30 hours, though my game did crash towards the end of the fight with Safer Sephiroth and I had to start the whole fight over again, which was annoying. Coming off a large game like Final Fantasy VII, I wanted to go back and beat a game that I played only briefly back when it came out, Orcs Must Die. It's a tower defense game and it got me through an afternoon, and all of a sudden it was over. After realizing how short the game was, I immediately started Orcs Must Die 2. I thoroughly enjoyed 2, as it greatly expanded upon the amount of traps and abilities and had more dynamic map design, leading to more intense moments. I even played through the campaign a second time with a friend because there was something so satisfying about standing still and watching orcs aimlessly walk into the death traps I'd be setting up. Back in 2014 I played To the Moon. It's a charming game about fulfilling the last wish of a dying man. The story stuck with me, and I remember the game ending on a teaser of the doctors moving on to their next patient. Unbeknownst to me, To the Moon has an expanded universe and a dedicated fan base who had been eagerly awaiting a follow-up on Eva and Neil's jobs. There was a mini-episode released in 2014 called The Bird Story that was set in the same universe, but the true follow-up came in 2017's Finding Paradise. This game picks up where To the Moon left off, but this time as a different patient, Colin, who was the young protagonist from A Bird Story, now an old man. His dying wish is for the doctors to enter his memory to change something, yet change nothing at all. In doing so, you explore different vignettes of Colin's life in order to figure out how to grant his wish. What unfolds is a touching tale that I would encourage anyone to play for themselves. Finding Paradise is a short experience, but one that left a big impact on me this year. Next up was Little Nightmares, an eerie puzzle platformer set upon a vessel shrouded in mystery. My main takeaway from the game was that the art style made me very uncomfortable, and I can't quite put my finger on it. I think it was the humans. They were like a sick and twisted crossover between Mr. Meaty and the Addams Family. The game was neat, but I was glad I didn't have to look at those monstrosities after only a couple of hours of playing. Speaking of monstrosities, it's time to talk about The Typing of the Dead Overkill. It's an alternate version of the Wii game The House of the Dead Overkill. Typing of the Dead sees you playing through the same game, but instead of being an on-rails light gun shooter, it's an on-rails keyboard shooter. The sheer absurdity of killing zombies with random words was a surprising breath of fresh air after the past few games I had played. The game even comes with the original The House of the Dead Overkill packed in, and while I did play that as well, for the purposes of this list, I'm not going to count it as its own game since it was essentially the same game except with actual gunplay. Wanting to scratch that itch for more typing, I decided to pick up The Novelist next. The Novelist follows the life of the Kaplan family as they go on vacation to help them reconnect amidst Dan's writer's block. Being pushed by his agent to finish his novel, you have to help Dan work to salvage not only his career but prevent his marriage from falling apart and spending time with their son who struggles making friends and suffers from loneliness. Your choices in the game play a delicate balancing act as you determine how you're going to spend Dan's precious time. World of Goo is one of the original indie darlings of the late 2000s that I just never got into. I went back and played it from start to finish this year, and I imagine the novelty of the game was a big selling point, especially since it released on the WiiWare service and likely benefited from the motion controls back then. I did get my 5,000th Steam achievement playing it though, so that was pretty neat. A trend that I had started to notice was that games that were critically acclaimed such as Ori and Hades lived up to the hype when I finally played them, and no game made that more apparent than Hazelight's It Takes Two. I never had someone to play it with though, but luckily a friend stepped up to the plate, and I didn't even have to buy the game to play. What I enjoyed about the game was just how many different types of gameplay were made available throughout the story. One minute you're riding beetles along trees, the next you're playing a top-down dungeon crawler, blink, and now you're playing volleyball amongst the clouds. It Takes Two is a game about putting your differences aside for the greater good, and it was some of the most enjoyment I had playing a game this year. I couldn't remember if I had previously beaten Rayman Origins. Ubisoft doesn't include achievements on their Steam games, nor did my old save file carry over. I distinctly remember getting to the top of the mountain and freeing the nymphs, but I couldn't recall beating the game or conquering the land of the living dead. Platformers are my favorite genre, and the UbiArt Rayman games are considered two of the best of all time. Speaking of UbiArt, I would love to see Ubisoft utilize this engine more often. More on that later. We've officially entered the platformer arc, as the next 4 games all fall under the same umbrella. Trine and Trine 2 are puzzle platformers that have you balance 3 connected characters' abilities in order to complete the game. Apparently they're on Trine 5 now, but I never managed to beat the original 2. A little side note, when I first got into PC gaming, I was using a regular computer that was designed for home use. It could handle simple games like Freddy Fish, but playing 3D games was another story entirely. From what I had read online, you needed something called a graphics card to play more modern games, and when I went to Best Buy to try and purchase one, an employee asked me what kind of games I wanted to play. I froze for a moment, not wanting to answer his question truthfully since I really wanted it to play Team Fortress 2, so I froze for a second and just said, Trine. I doubt he even knew what Trine was, but that moment lives rent-free in my head all these years later. Perhaps the worst 2 games I played all year were Sonic the Hedgehog 4 Episode 1 and Episode 2. These games are, for lack of a better term, unmitigated disasters. There's nothing redeeming about these games. Visually, they look terrible. Controls? Awful. Music? Mediocre by Sonic standards. Physics? Complete garbage. No wonder Sega cancelled the planned Episode 3, because the first 2 were so bad that even the biggest Sonic fans would riot. The Sonic Vor I see on Twitter is a more enjoyable experience than playing these games. Brütal Legend's heavy metal-inspired world brought me back to the days of Guitar Hero and Rock Band when I was first exposed to the legends of the genre. The game takes a turn for the worse around the halfway point though, when it morphs into a full-fledged real-time strategy game. I was content with the remedial combat system and the commanding my small army of headbangers, but the RTS elements did not mesh well with the rest of the game. Remedy's Alan Wake is known for its narrative and storytelling, but when it came to the gameplay, it kinda fell flat in my opinion. One of the main drawbacks is the awkward combination of gunplay and flashlight usage. While the concept of using light to weaken enemies before being able to damage them was intriguing, the execution was a bit cumbersome. Having to frequently juggle between managing ammunition and focusing the flashlight disrupted the fluidity of combat encounters, and it began to frustrate me as I just wanted to finish the story rather than worrying about resource management. Where the first Alan Wake faltered, the spin-off, Alan Wake's American Nightmare, shined. The gunplay was much more responsive and fun, and there was a larger selection of weapons in Alan's arsenal. Unfortunately, you repeatedly play through the game's 3 levels multiple times with very few differences, and unless you're following all of the hidden manuscript pages throughout the game, it's hard to keep track of the story and understand what exactly is going on. Overall, the Alan Wake games were fine, but I can definitely see why they are considered cult classics. They just weren't my cup of tea. One game that I was pleasantly surprised by was Pac-Man and the Ghostly Adventures. I grew up playing plenty of licensed 3D platformer games, and this took me back to my childhood. Based on the titular TV show, which I've never seen, it has you going from level to level to save Pacopolis from the evil Proteus. The game has its faults, like the frame rate during cutscenes and desynced audio, but I enjoyed the basic gameplay enough to where I nearly got all the achievements in my playthrough, so I went back and got the rest that I was missing for the 100% completion. While I didn't time my second playthrough, I'm fairly certain I could compete for the world record speedrun, so that's something I look forward to doing later next year. In the wake of Deep Silver Volition shutting down, I chose to honor them by playing Red Faction Guerrilla Remastered, a third-person action game about liberating Mars. The key feature of the Red Faction series is the destructible environments, and I really enjoyed leveling buildings to their foundation in the middle of a firefight, just because I could. The story was mostly forgettable, and I much rather preferred driving around in the open world and destroying the civilization that the humans had built upon the planet. Do you remember watching the original trailer for We Happy Few, and walking away enamored with the idea? A dystopian society where the citizens are drugged in order to not see the collapse of society around them? Where you can look at a dead rat and only see a fun piñata? I was excited for the game, and when it eventually released in early access, I was disappointed that Compulsion Games' vision was to create a roguelike survival game instead of the Bioshock-esque narrative I had come to expect from the trailer. It turns out the general audience agreed with me, that the idea of We Happy Few was much more intriguing than the gameplay itself. They later attempted to retcon this, and instead focus on building a narrative about how the citizens of Wellington Wells become aware of the reality that's been hiding underneath the surface, and attempt to escape the city. I'm glad they ended up going in this direction, because the world building easily was the highlight of We Happy Few for me. You could still see some of the original gameplay elements creeping up throughout the game though, and they did feel out of place. The thirst and hunger system, crafting, inventory management all felt like relics of their original vision, and I would have liked to see them rework those mechanics since they either ended up being cumbersome or outright useless. I played through all of Sally's story without even crafting her chemical weapons. Seeing how the three protagonists' stories intertwined and how they saw things from their perspective was a neat touch, and Uncle Jack's looming presence was felt across the city. We Happy Few was a great idea for a game that was just held back by a couple of poor choices, and I'd be interested in seeing how they would improve upon them in a sequel. After a brief diversion to Wellington Wells, I returned to the world of Red Faction Armageddon, Volition's follow-up to Guerrilla. For some bizarre reason, Armageddon takes place entirely underneath the surface of Mars, and instead of being open world like its predecessor, it's entirely linear. I found the story easier to follow just because of the linearity of the game, but the game itself wasn't as fun to play as Guerrilla. Also, my game soft-locked in the area just before the final boss, and I ended up having to replay the final chapter since the game didn't include autosaves. It was a disappointing experience all around. My partner in crime from It Takes Two returned to play through A Way Out with me, and out of every game I played this year, no story beat caught me by surprise as much as the revelation towards the end of the game. Breaking out of prison together was fun, and seeing Vincent and Leo's relationship develop from strangers to friends to brothers was great to see. I also came to the conclusion that Leo's son is actually Alex Caruso, and there's nothing you can say that can convince me otherwise. Control's combat system was my favorite out of any game I played this year. The psychic abilities are all satisfying to use and abuse, the shape-shifting service weapon lets you tailor the game to your playstyle, and the world building that Remedy manages while keeping the game setting within the confines of a single building was outstanding. I've mentioned previously that games that feature time travel often confuse me, and the same goes for alternate dimensions, which Control heavily features. I've spent many hours combing through YouTube explanation videos and Reddit deep dives about the game, and while I think I can comprehend the story well enough, I don't know if I'll ever truly get it. Control was another game that I enjoyed enough to go for 100% in, and I can see why it was showered with Game of the Year awards back in 2019. Easily my favorite game in the Remedyverse. A game that seemingly came out of nowhere this year was Dave the Diver. Part exploration, part Metroidvania, part management sim, you play as the titular Dave and, well, dive. Your task was supplying a newly opened sushi restaurant with fish from the nearby Blue Hole. As you delve deeper into the depths below, you progressively catch bigger fish that allow you to cook better meals, which in turn gives you money to buy better equipment to go even deeper and catch even bigger fish. There's so much packed into this game, including a story mode, managing your restaurant, training your employees, feeding the local cat, seahorse racing, boss fights, photography, cooking shows, farming, gambling, the list goes on and on. I could gush about Dave the Diver for hours, and, like Control before it, I obtained 100% of the achievements, and after all of that, I still wanted to keep diving to catch just one more fish. Mario has always been a special character to me. Super Mario Sunshine is my favorite video game of all time, and other games in the series always manage to release during critical moments in my life. Like many others though, I felt the new Super Mario Bros. Series started to grow stale, and after the series lay dormant for nearly 10 years, Mario returned to his 2D roots this year in Super Mario Bros. Wonder. The game did away with the plastic aesthetic that had plagued the new series for years, and instead opted for a much more animated and colorful world. The tiniest details make the biggest difference, and things like Mario's mustache bouncing as you run full speed made the game feel more alive than ever before. The Wonder Flower transformations were a big highlight, as were the 3 new power-ups, and the badge system is a great way for players to create their own difficulty. Koji Kondo never fails to disappoint when it comes to music, and Super Mario Bros. Wonder knocks it out of the park as per usual. I can't play a Mario game and not go for 100%, so that makes 3 games in a row in October with 100% completion. Maybe this was worth the effort I was putting in after all, as I seem to be enjoying the games again as of late. And then the Bureau XCOM Declassified happened. I've tried playing XCOM Enemy Unknown a couple of times, and every time I end up quitting relatively quickly since it just never seems to click with me. With the Bureau, I was hoping that there being a story to guide me into the third-person shooting would improve the experience, but in the end I still couldn't connect with the gameplay and made me come to the conclusion that XCOM just isn't for me. The same could be said for Antichamber. I played my fair share of first-person puzzle games like Portal and The Witness, 2 of the best games I've ever played, but Antichamber is a case where it felt like the developers came across as saying, "We are smarter than you." I can appreciate the game for what it is, but it's not making my Mount Rushmore of first-person puzzlers. Despite what my PC backlog might have you believe, I've beaten every game I own for the Nintendo Switch, except for one, Runner 3. I'm a fan of the Bit Trip Runner series, and I love the evolution from the original to Bit Trip presents Runner 2 Future Legend of Rhythm Alien. Needless to say, when I saw the trailer for Runner 3 and the series adding more layers, I was excited, but my enjoyment of the game dwindled as I played it years ago, and at some point I just put the game down and never came back to it. I wanted to finish off my Switch collection, so I booted it back up and came away disappointed. Runner 3's aesthetics are honestly hard to look at, and the gameplay felt like it took 1 step forward, 2 steps back from Runner 2, and the music, the hallmark of the Bit Trip series, was very repetitive and not as memorable as the first 2 games. Lumino City was a neat little point-and-click adventure game made entirely out of household objects. It was almost like playing a stop-motion animation film, and it brought me back to my childhood when my brothers and I would make simple stop-motion movies with our digital blue camcorder. It was a very short game, but I enjoyed the short time I spent with it. Much like XCOM, I've tried playing Mark of the Ninja on and off a handful of times, but I never ended up making much progress before inevitably dropping it for something else. The game's comic book-esque art and fluid animations really enhance the experience as you make your way through the campaign while remaining unseen. I really like the optional challenges in each level, and the hidden challenge rooms were great motivators to explore the world in its entirety. Whenever games offer a stealthy option, I'll usually attempt to go that route until it inevitably comes crashing down, and I end up dropping the act and going guns blazing. This was easier said than done in the 2014 reboot of Thief. The combat in the game is very lackluster, so staying in the shadows is critical to make your way through the city. I'm not familiar with the original Thief trilogy, so I didn't know much about Garrett or if any of the world building present in the reboot is from the original games, but for a newcomer to the franchise, it was easy to follow and just tropey enough to not be overbearing. Circling back down the RPG route, we've come to Ubisoft's Child of Light. It's another beautiful game utilizing the UbiArt framework, and the turn-based combat was just simple enough for me to enjoy while also allowing me to plan my attacks in such a way to where I'd be able to get multiple turns in before the enemy could even get one off. The storybook narration was charming and easy enough for a child to follow, and I could see this being a great introduction to RPGs for kids, or for those who are normally averse to them like myself. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order is the best Star Wars game since the original LEGO trilogy. It captures the essence of both lightsaber combat and force abilities in a way I can't recall other games in the franchise ever doing. There's weight behind every action you take with the iconic weapon, and it's the closest thing to a Souls game I've ever played. The game has multiple planets to explore, but it is fairly linear with where you can go on said planets. It was nice to see a Star Wars property avoid shoving Tatooine down my throat for the umpteenth time, and even the one planet I was familiar with, Kashyyyk, had me stopping constantly to take in the scenery. Jedi Fallen Order feels like the Star Wars game we all wanted to play as a kid, and Respawn knocked it out of the park. One of the first indie games I ever remembered hearing about was Cave Story. Several users on an online forum I belonged to back in the late 2000s talked about the game and would display it prominently on their profiles. I only ever played it for a minute or two over a decade ago and never went back to it. Upon picking it up once more, I found myself enjoying the weapon upgrade mechanic, as it emphasized shooting as much as possible while being mindful of not getting hit as to not lose your progress. Couldn't tell you a thing about the story though. Something about rabbits and a doctor. I was left with more questions than answers, and I'm still wondering what happened to Balrog. He just left at one point. I'll miss that talking lunchbox. Have you ever fallen victim to games that can be categorized as YouTube bait? That was me back in 2013 when I saw the game Drunken Robot Pornography on the Steam store and thought it was top-notch comedy to have the word pornography in the title of the game. Completely forgot about the game for years until I saw it in the Play Next shelf of my library and figured, why not? Shockingly, there was no pornography whatsoever in the game, but it wasn't short on robots or alcohol. It's a high-paced first-person shooter where you take down gigantic mechs who broke into your bar, or something. The story isn't important. The gameplay was addicting, and there's a built-in level editor and mech builder, but as you might imagine, the game isn't exactly bustling with players, so I didn't try out those features, but the 51 levels across the campaign were more than enough to satisfy me. Shatter is a shining example of teaching an old dog new tricks. Taking the classic gameplay from Arkanoid and Breakout, but with added abilities to control the ball's trajectory, as well as creative boss fights. It's a great arcade game to challenge yourself to beat your high score, if that's your jam. Feeling the itch to play more arcade-style games, I chose to end off the year with Bit Trip Beat, a rhythm-based Pong-like experience. You bounce the various beats with your ever-changing paddle across 3 levels, ending in a boss fight themed after block-breaking games like Arkanoid and Breakout. It all culminates in a one-on-one showdown with gaming's founding father, Pong. This was without a doubt one of the hardest bosses I fought in any game this year, as failing to get to 15 points before Mr. Pong Paddle results in you having to play through the final stage in its entirety again, which takes around 15 minutes. It didn't feel right to pause and take a minute to compose myself before the fight, so I went at it each time with my hands beginning to go numb after the high-intensity beat blocking. Maybe it was my own bravado getting in the way, but I lost 3 or 4 times before I finally managed to come out victorious and cross Bit Trip Beat off my backlog. 12 months, 63 games, 900 achievements, hundreds of hours, one looming question: was this all worth it? I got to partake in my favorite activity year-round and actively try out new experiences and revisit old ones that I gave up on too early, but I find it hard to tell if I actually enjoyed this process overall. Sure, it was nice to go through my backlog and justify buying these games over the years, but for every game I beat, I started to dread picking the next one to tackle. There's so many games to choose from nowadays that it's easy for gems to get lost in the shuffle over time, yet even when I uncovered a diamond in the rough, I'd end up finishing it and then just moving on to the next game soon after without giving it time to breathe. I found time to play other games like Dota throughout the year, but every hour I spent not playing the games in my backlog felt like time wasted, and I wasn't able to enjoy my time with my common rotation of games that I normally play. I can't say I can see myself doing this again next year, or anytime soon, and maybe I'll never clear through the 200 plus games still waiting to be played, and that's okay. At the end of the day, I set a goal for myself this year and I stuck with it, which is the biggest commitment to seeing a story through to its end that I undertook this year. The final boss was me, all along.